Hi everyone, this is Counseling 2250, Robinson Wood, Chapter 8, People of Asian Descent, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Alright, discourse about Asians. You'll probably have heard of these stereotypes, right? Successful, model minority, emotionally restrained, perceived not to be angry like African Americans and Latinx, brilliant in math and science, smarter than Caucasians, they're Buddhists, they're studious and hardworking, foreign-born, scientists, women are exotic, and enduring marriages. So these are some of the things that Asian people are perceived to be, right, when you automatically think of them. But we'll be exploring some of these ideas and maybe some of the reasons why people believe this as we go through this chapter. All right, Asians. People having origins in any of the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent. So we're talking about countries such as Cambodia, China, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Pakistan, Philippine Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam. But there are more than 40 cultural groups, hundreds of languages and dialects, and a wide array of religions. Vietnamese are the most recent immigrant group to arrive in the United States, and that's starting around April and December from 1975 because they were basically refugees from Vietnam and Cambodia because of the Vietnam War. So we're talking about 100,000 people coming over. Southeast Asia, south of China and east of India, are countries such as Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Burma, or now it's known as also Myanmar, Bhutan, and Bangladesh. The Pacific Islands are 22 islands such as Micronesia, Guam, Palau, Carolines, the Marianas, the Marshalls, and the Gilberts. And then there's Melanesia, which is Fiji. Okay, so you can see there's actually different groups. Okay. All right, let's talk about the history. Asian ancestral linkage to Paleo-Americans or the first Native Americans. And we talked about that when we talked about the Native American chapter, how when they did a DNA testing, they saw that that there were basically linkages to Asia. The DNA analysis of Clovis Child in New Mexico around 12,600 years ago, and female teenager in the Yucatan caves, which was about 13,000 years ago. Chinese have the longest Asian history in the United States. West Coast during the 1840s because they were cheap labor for the transcontinental railroads. They also worked with the Irish when it came to the railroads. However, both were paid about the $31 per month, but Chinese had to work longer hours and had to sleep in tents, while the Irish actually had buildings where they were able to sleep in lodging. And part of the reasons why people were coming from China was because of farming difficulties due to flooding in China, political instability due to taxation and ethnic conflicts. 50 Chinese people became 12,000 in the West. Chinese were also hoping to find gold in California. In the 1860s, 80% of Chinese women aged 15 to 16 in America were prostitutes and concubines for Asians and Caucasians. Slavery, kidnapping, deception, and of course auction blocks to sell these women. In 1849 to 1854, there was free competition. In 1854 to 1925, there was slavery. There's also this thing called the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was basically a 10-year ban on Chinese people from immigrating to the United States, only law to ban a specific nationality from coming to America. In 1868, this was called the Meiji Restoration period in Japan. 141 Japanese men, women, and children arrived in Hawaii to work on sugarcane plantations. Later on, Koreans, Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans also came to Hawaii. In Japan, there were tax increases, sweeping reform, losing land to the government, and poverty, such as in cities called Yamaguchi, Hiroshima, and Kumamoto. In 1885 to 1925, 200,000 Japanese left for Hawaii. 180,000 Japanese left for mainland US. Although Asians represented over half of Hawaii, they could not vote. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, which was a US Navy base, was attacked by the Japanese. Other bases that were also attacked were in the Philippines, Guam, and the Midway Atoll. 3,000 soldiers, sailors, and civilians were killed during this. I'm sure you guys all saw the movie called Pearl Harbor. If not, please watch it. You'll see kind of a dramatization of that. Executive Order 9066 signed by Franklin D. Roosevelt due to anti-Japanese sentiments. 110,000 West Coast Japanese Americans and 3/4 were Nisei. Nisei means second generation Americans, and Issei, which is Japan born, were not allowed to become American citizens. All of this was unconstitutional because there were no warrants, indictments, or hearings. They were just put in together in this group. Forced to leave their homes and move to internment camps for 3 years. Given 2 to 5 days to sell all of their property or give it away. So a lot of them just lost it because how much can you do in 2 to 5 days, right? So here I linked it to some information when it comes to the Japanese concentration camps or internment camps that existed in America. And actually, if you are living in Los Angeles, I encourage you guys to go to the Japanese American Museum, which is in Little Tokyo or in downtown, so that you can visit and look at the history that we have when it comes to the treatment of Asian people in America. Historically, many Asian Americans were low-skilled and low-wage laborers. Today, lived in mixed neighborhoods, married across racial lines. In the 1960s, there were about 500,000 people, and in 2011, 11.6 million immigrants and refugees that will come here for work, such as railroads, cotton, sugarcane, technology, medicine, and of course for war, World War II, Korean War, and the Vietnam War. Now let's talk about the demographics. There are 7 Asian categories. 1 is Asian Indian, 2 Chinese, 3 Filipino, 4 Japanese, 5 Korean, 6 Vietnamese, 7 is other Asian. In the 2010 census, 5.6% of the population is Asian or mixed Asian, which is basically about 17.3 million people. When you see the word other Asian, what does that mean? It means Bhutanese, Burmese, or now known as also Myanmar, Indo-Chinese, Iwo Jima, Madagascan, Maldivian, Nepalese, Okinawan, Singaporean, Hmong, Laotian, Thai, Pakistani, and Cambodian. Okay, now let's talk about Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. 2010, about 0.2% or about 540,000 Native Hawaiians or other Pacific Islanders. So there are different categories and we're going to talk about them right now. Native Hawaiians, Guamanians, Chamorros, and Samoan. There's also the Polynesian, which is Tahitian, Tongan, and Tokoluan. There's also the Micronesian, which is the Marshallese, the Palauans, and the Chukis. And then there's the Malaysian, which is Fijian, Guinean, and Solomon Islander. And again, I apologize if I'm saying some of these words incorrectly. Again, the vocabulary words, that you can see the spelling is, a little difficult sometimes. Now let's talk about biracial children. Most common would be Caucasian men and Asian women. 37% of Asian women married outside of their ethnicity. And I wish we had a class about this because then we can also talk about this, amongst ourselves and understand that some Asian women feel like the responsibilities that are put upon them because of cultural expectations are not worth, dealing with. And so they might leave and have relationships with people outside of their ethnicity. That's just one exploration, and hopefully maybe one of these days we can all have this conversation and just talk about it, right? It's not bad or good, again. It's just interesting to be able to talk about that. Caucasian Asian couples have higher combined earnings than Caucasian or Asian. That was just a fact that the book had brought up. In this slide, I just want to show you some people who are actually of biracial ethnicities. Christy Teigen, which is the one on the left, and there is Paul Mark Gosselaar, I believe from Saved by the Bell. Sean Lennon, which is John Lennon and Yoko Ono's child. Naomi Campbell is part Chinese. Tyson Beckford, who is a model, is also part Chinese. And then, of course, the famous Tiger Woods, who is half Thai. Let's talk now about the largest populations Chinese, Filipino, Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese when it comes to people in America. California is the top state to have all top 6 Asian groups. West Coast, 49% of Chinese and Vietnamese people live there, 25% of Indians, 70% of Japanese, 43.7% of Koreans, 71% of Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders. 30% of Asians live in the South, 30% of Asians live in the Northeast, and 16% of Asians live in the Midwest. Nearly 3/4, or about 74%, of Asian American adults were born abroad. So a lot of them are actually not born here. Half say they speak English very well, half says that they do not. After Spanish, Chinese is the most widely spoken non-English language in the home. Asian recently passed Hispanics as the largest group of new immigrants to the United States. 6 in 10 adults ages 25 to 64 who come from Asia have at least a bachelor's degree when compared to non-Asian immigrants. Highest educated cohort of immigrants in the United States history is Asian people. Now let's talk about social, psychological, and physical health issues. The demographics of Asian ethnic groups differ on many measures. The highest income and education, 7 in 10 Indian Americans have a college degree. 5 out of 10 with college degrees are Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Filipino. 2.5 out of 10 with college degree is the Vietnamese. The highest rates of poverty in the United States are people who are Vietnamese, Korean, and Chinese, because there's just so many, right? Asian children are more likely to live in married coupled households. The East, people marry first and then love. The West, people love first and then marry. 4.7% of Asians are divorced compared to the US, which is 10.2. 10% of Asians are separated, widowed, or divorced. Married, Indian, 69%. Single is biracial Asian and Caucasian, about 50.5%. Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, about 33%. 60% married households, 26% live alone or live with non-related roommates, 9% of female-led households, and then 5% male-led households. Asian grandparents do not live with grandchildren except for Pacific Islanders. Again, that's a general statement. I will say that a lot of the people I know who are not Pacific Islanders have grandparents who live with them still. Asians who own homes, 306,000 compared to the Caucasian, which is 152,000. Age 25 and older, 85% have graduated from high school, whereas the general US is 86.5, so it's very similar. 50% of Asians have a bachelor's degree. 20.3% of single race Asians have a graduate degree, and 14.4% of Pacific Islanders have a bachelor's degree, and 4% of Pacific Islanders have a graduate degree. 46% at work in a management or professional occupation, such as sales and office, service occupations, or low income or low numbers are in construction. So you can sort of see like the focus when it comes to Asian people in this book, especially, is about attainment of education, right? Because the perspective is that that will enable you to then find higher paying jobs. Avoid the idea of the model minority. So if you've never heard of the model minority before, what it basically means is of all the minorities or people of color, Asians are the ones that all the other minorities should look up to or become. And that's a very, very dangerous thing to say. And the reason why is basically that is pitting or basically placing one minority against another, when really we should be fighting the oppressors, right? Does that make sense to you guys? And obviously, if you are Caucasian and you're listening, we're not saying you specifically. We're talking about the system that was created over hundreds of years that oppresses people of color or minorities, right? But the thing is, a lot of people still have that value or see Asian people as a model minority, and then they become actually hated as opposed to being able to work with each other. Asian American success is a stereotype, interferes with economically disadvantaged Asian American communities receiving necessary emotional and financial resources. So, like we said before, there are so many Asian countries, and not all of them are very successful. Like we had seen before, Vietnamese people are not notoriously known for being very successful, right? You might know some Vietnamese people are successful, but in general, that's what it's saying is that actually a majority of Vietnamese people live in poverty. But the thing is, because everyone thinks that all Asian people are smart and successful, then a community of Vietnamese people might not get the help that they need. Let's say grant monies or whatever, because they're like, oh well, Asian people are always rich and successful anyways. They don't need any of our help, and that keeps the, let's say, the those Asian people who are in lower socioeconomic status from ever getting out of there, right? Or getting help that they need to be able to succeed. Creates diversion among groups of color. Like I said before, it basically pits one against each other, like blacks against Latinos against Asians, and really why are they all fighting together, or why are we all fighting together? It's not necessary, and that's not the point. The point is to fight systemic oppression and racism so that we can all be treated equally and live in a fair, really just world. Vietnamese people, Vietnamese people have a high rate of poverty and difficulties with social adjustment, which basically means that they don't necessarily become acculturated in Western culture very easily, right? Average Asian income is half of Pacific Islanders. So we're talking about half of the Vietnamese population actually make half of the Pacific Islanders' income. So here are some memes on this page that talk about that model minority, right? Asians, not Besians, like as in A grades, not B grades. The second one is you got 99 problems, must finish each one, right? That's talking about math problems and how Asians are always so smart in math. Your sister gets a B on the math test. Congratulations, you're an only child now, right? And again, the stress of having to always get A's can ruin Asian people's lives, right? It might not necessarily seem so serious, like, oh my gosh, you got a B. But for some Asians, they will get into a lot of trouble if they got a B or receive a B as a grade. And of course, the last meme is A's before B's, right? Again, school before anything else, before your, before anything else, right? B's. So again, these are model minority memes that are kind of funny, but bittersweet funny. It's sad funny as opposed to really funny, right? Substance abuse among Asians are on the rise. PTSD and depression for refugees due to war, such as people from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. There's also the communist Pol Pot, who is the leader of the Khmer Rouge, or Cambodia's killing fields. I'm sure you've heard of it before. 1/3 of the population was killed, so that's considered a genocide. The stressors, discrimination on the job, English difficulties on test, conflict between Asian and American values, the stereotype of the model minority within the culture. People who internalize this don't ask for help, which increases their feelings of isolation, right? Because they don't feel like they should complain because let's say they have a really great life or whatever, then they don't actually get to express the sadness or the stressors, and then that will then eat them alive basically, or mentally make them unstable, let's say. Now let's talk about microaggressions. I think we already described or talked a little bit about microaggressions, which are sometimes things that may sound like a compliment, but really remind you that you're still different, right? So a common one is a microaggression is to a minority person is, wow, your English is really good, right? It sounds like a compliment, like your English is really good. But that's what it's saying is, as a person who is not white, or as a person who doesn't look like they belong in America originally, right? But again, we have to remember America is just full of diversity, right? And there are generations upon generations of different ethnicities who've been here. So it's just a microaggression reminds you that you are different. Ascription of intelligence, exoticization of Asian women, invalidation of inter-ethnic differences, which basically means ignoring the fact that Asians are not all the same people, right? There's Chinese, there's Koreans, there's Laotian, there's Hmong, there's so many, but sometimes people just put all Asians together as one, right? The denial of racial reality, pathologizing cultural values or communication styles. So that example would be a person who doesn't really talk a lot, because in Asian culture, for some Asian cultures, you don't talk unless you're spoken to. So in Western culture, that might seem to be antisocial, but really that's just the cultural value system right there. Second class citizenship, and of course, invisibility. And when we talk about invisibility, we're talking about how many Asian people can you name off the top of your head? Um, or let's say, how many Asians would you say are considered heartthrobs or dreamy, hot, sexy guys or women? Or in between. So the thing is, you need to realize that Asians are very invisible in America, right? Except for in maybe doctors or scientists or computers or whatever. But in popular culture, how many, let's say, Asian musicians do you know besides K-pop? Right? K-pop is really big now. But besides K-pop, do you know any American Asian singers? Can you name 5? Probably not. Insufficient attention devoted to family dysfunction. So verbal, sexual, emotional abuse of children, communication problems, and harsh parenting practices are areas that society doesn't look at when it comes to Asians raising their children or in their families, right? And it is very dysfunctional for some of it. In 2009, Asian American women had the second highest rate of suicide among those aged 15 to 24. Let me just read that to you guys again. Asian American women had the second highest rate of suicide among those aged 15 to 24. So now you ought to think about, whoa, what's going on that is doing this, right? There's a thing called fractured identity. That is wanting to honor their family, basically like, following the traditional customs and values. But also there's enormous pressure to measure up with the idea of being a perfect Asian woman, right? And a lot of people cannot be perfect, right? Do you think you're perfect? It would be really stressful if you're like, I need to be perfect at everything, right? English speakers play a large factor in seeking help for nervous or emotional problems. So again, speaking English is a barrier. Okay, therapy is more successful in one study when language was matched with the client and therapist. Somaticization is common for Asian experiencing psychosocial stress. So for example, it would be headaches. And we saw that with Latinx culture as well, where when you're stressed out, suddenly you have a migraine or a headache or a stomach ache or something like that, you develop an ulcer, right? So stress in Asian culture, you don't talk about, oh, I'm really stressed out. No, you're going to say, I have an ulcer, or I'm getting lots of headache. And that isn't really a physical thing, really. It is a physical thing, but it's not really, right? The real problem is really the stressors of, let's say, cultural expectations and value systems and stuff like that. Now let's talk about family life, which we briefly mentioned earlier. Asian families are patriarchal families, which basically means that the father, patriarchy, is the one who's in control of everything. They say everything, how things go, you just do it. You do not argue, right? Authority and communication exercised from top to bottom. Again, that means who is the highest person. They can say and they decide everything for the family, which would be the father, right? Interdependent roles, which basically means that the families do depend on each other to maintain those cultural values, right? We all work together, even though the father is the one who tells you what to do or the husband tells you what to do, but you're doing it all together to maintain a family system. Strict adherence to traditional norms, and minimization of conflict by suppression of overt emotion. So what that means is you do not want to start a family fight or anything like that. So instead, you're just not going to talk about it. No problems. You cannot complain about anything or anything at all, right? And the reason why is because you don't want them to be in imbalance, right? Whatever the highest person says goes, and you just work with it. If you have problems, you pretend like it's not there and stuff like that. So guilt and shame are used to control family members. Obligations to the family take precedence over individual prerogatives, which basically means like you might have needs, right? But what the family needs is more important than what your needs are. Okay? And of course, honoring the family, which means basically saving face, which is a term that basically means do not embarrass your family, okay, in any way. Even asking for help, you might embarrass the family because it shows that the family doesn't know how to solve something. Seen as family failures are delinquency, which basically means not behaving properly, school failure, unemployment, and then mental illness. So you can see how Asian families might see disability or invisible disabilities such as mental illness. And so it could be seen as embarrassing or whatever. And that's why sometimes you'll see in Asian families, the child that has a disability is kind of hidden, like no one sees that person or talks to that person very often. Now let's talk about filial piety. Basically, that means dedication and deference or respect of children to their parents. So basically, children are there to do what the parents are asking them to do. Okay? And that's it, you don't question them. The inability to express this tradition properly leads to problems. First generation is expected to be providers, but not all are successful. So first generation, again, are the people who are born in a different country and come here. So they work really, really hard to provide for their children. But unfortunately, here's the thing. Is everyone successful? No. Some people are just not. And that causes a lot of stress within the family. Second generation may not be faithful to the traditional values of the parents. They also have to deal with racism and personal pride. So when you are born in America, you have to deal with your parents who are born in a different country with different value expectations. So you have to satisfy that, but then you also have to satisfy Western culture as well, right? Like the things that your friends are doing who are not Asian, let's say, you want to do those things too because they're fun or whatever, but now you have two different cultures that you're trying to balance together. Both self-worth is questioned, which leads to guilty feelings and, of course, anxiety. Now let's talk about acculturation and experiences in America. Here are some factors that talk about whether or not you're able to balance, let's say, Asian culture with the Western culture. Length of time in the United States, access to the resources, English language fluency, educational level, employment status, generational status. Generational status means like grandparents, parents, or children. What status are you? Age, neighborhood, ethnic density, which basically means how many people of your culture are in your neighborhood that you live in, country of birth, kinship structures, and purpose of immigration. So I'll give you an example when it comes to neighborhood ethnic density. My mom basically speaks Chinese and speaks Vietnamese. However, well, where we grew up, basically everyone was also very similar to us as well. So she has never left that neighborhood because she doesn't want to go somewhere where she has to speak English because she actually doesn't really speak English. Even though she's lived here for over 40 years, she does not really speak more than like first grade, kindergarten English. So she would not know how to navigate to get resources if she moved out of that neighborhood. Large populations in the United States means you're healthier and happier. So that means as more of your ethnicity and in your surroundings, you will feel healthier because you have access to the community and that, that feeling of family togetherness or cohesion or collectivism, right? So that talks about Chinese, Filipinos, Koreans, and Indian Asians. Lower socioeconomic groups would be refugees because those are people who are coming because of some sort of unfortunate circumstance such as, war and stuff like that. Cultural maintenance. Cultural identity characteristics that are considered important. So we talk about upholding some of those values that come in Asian culture, right? There's also contact and participation. The extent to which groups deem it important to become involved with other cultural groups or remain primarily among themselves. And the example that I would say currently would be the movie Crazy Rich Asians, right? So it's all Asian people hanging out together. And part of that is, remember we talked about invisibility in America? So basically if other cultures don't really welcome us, we're just going to stick together and we're going to do the things ourselves. So you don't see a lot of Asian people in movies, like in the theaters and stuff like that when we were able to go out to the theaters. So instead, Asian people basically got together and really took over a whole portion of YouTube. So if you go onto YouTube, you'll see a tons of Asian actors, models, and all that other stuff because they were able to help each other and say, you know what, if they don't want us, we're going to do it ourselves. Okay, so we've talked about this with all the different cultures so far when it comes to like the level of Asian identity versus Western identity, right? So assimilation is when a person internalizes the dominant culture and rejects the indigenous culture. So for assimilation, what that is saying is you, as an Asian person, really believe in Western culture, but not the Asian culture. So you ignore the Asian part of you, right? Separation is maintenance of proficiency in the dominant culture, but does not adapt to the dominant culture. So you're working kind of more in the middle-ish, right? But there's also segregation, which is a dominance group stance with respect to the non-dominant group. So again, you're separating each other. And then there's integration, which is maintenance of cultural integrity while seeking to participate in the larger social network of a multicultural society. So what that is saying is that you are going to have your Asian values, but you also will understand that you need to work within the Western cultures to be successful. Okay. And then there's marginalization, which is when a person rejects both the indigenous and the dominant culture. So people who might not say that they're Asian or American or whatever, they're just humans or people. And when we talk about, Asian cultures versus Western culture and how what your levels are, we talk about also arranged marriages as still practice and very acceptable in some Asian cultures. Asian-born children being adopted by primarily Caucasian parents. So you guys might have seen some of your Asian classmates or friends who have Caucasian parents. They were adopted because of it was very popular for a while. It still is. So you'll see Koreans who were adopted by Caucasians. So they don't speak Korean at all. They speak only English and stuff like that. And there was actually a whole time where it was super popular and common. Success in business is considered Korean, called K, Chinese called Wo, and then Japanese is called Tanamoshi. So what that is basically because the banks were not necessarily helping Asian people, they created their own like little banks themselves within their own communities, and then they would loan each other money or whatever and do it that way because they were not able to get help from, let's say, a westernized bank. So systems that enable successful people to help newcomers through a lending and borrowing system. Less discrimination than would be seen at an American bank. Okay, so again, when society doesn't welcome us, we will work together in our own culture to help each other grow and lift each other up. That's what it's basically saying. Now let's talk about cultural orientation and values. There's cultural values that are influenced by Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. So now let's talk a little bit about each one briefly. Buddhism, 5th and 6th centuries by Siddhartha Gautama, also known as Buddha. First noble truth is suffering. Okay, understanding the root of suffering, so you understand why people suffer, the cessation of suffering, that it also will stop, and being on the path to refrain from what causes suffering. So if you know what is causing the suffering and you know how to stop it, then now we're going to try to not go into that, right? Not get into that drama. So kind of staying away from all that stuff so that we don't feel the pain or anything like that. Hinduism was created in 15 BC. There are two sacred books called the Vedas and the Upanishads. There's also the caste system, and the caste system is basically kind of like a hierarchy of importance of people, basically different classes of people. The Brahmins are considered the priests or the highest level, and the Shudras are the peasants and the laborers, and those are considered the lowest level. And there's class levels in between as well. Confucius was born in 551 BC, China's most influential philosopher. Emphasized family loyalty, hard work, and respect for parents and elders. So you can see how that cultural existence happens, right? All right, now there's also Taoism, which emphasizes harmony in nature and contemplation. So about who we are as humans and our relationship to nature. There's also Wei Wei or Wei Wei, doing nothing or inaction was emphasized. So not to get into the drama, right? Modesty, simplicity, absence of ambition for power, right? So just to live, right? And you can sort of see how sometimes you'll meet Asian people who are very, very indifferent, or they really don't show any emotion to one way or another. You can sort of see how cultural religions or cultural value systems have affected Asian people, and that is why they react or they behave the way that they do. So it's not necessarily a pathology or a disease or anything like that, because in Western culture you'll see that as that, but it really isn't. It's actually the way of being, of growing up and living and surviving. Now let's talk about religion. Half of Chinese do not identify with a religion. Filipinos are Catholics, half of Indians are Hindu, Koreans are Protestant, and Vietnamese are Buddhist. Here's some common values that are shared: harmony in relationships, emotional restraint, so basically not showing any emotion, precedence of group interests over individual interests, so we're talking about collectivism, extended family, deference to authority, obedience to and respect for parents, emphasis on hard work, fulfilling obligations, and high value associated with education. So you can see the common values when it comes to the Asian culture, and it can be very different than other cultures as well, and to be acknowledgeable about that. Common cultural values among people of Asian descent are also reserve and constraint, benevolence, basically being kind, personhood, humanity, influence of past relationships on present social relationships, so how the past affects the current or the future. Concerns for maintaining face, which is like, remember I said before, saving face, which is not embarrassing the family. Being thrift, which basically means, again, smart with your money, or don't spend any money when you don't really need to. Do you need that pair of shoes? No, you don't, right? So then don't buy it. Interpersonal harmony in relationships, social favors, exchange in the form of money, goods, and information. So you give these things to show status, basically. Precedence of group interests over individual interests, educational attainment and achievement, obedience to authority, marriage, emotional self-control, honor given to elders, and modesty and humility, and patriarchy. Again, some of this is more review of what we've been talking about so far, right? Focus on what parents can do for their children and then what the children can do for their parents. So again, we see that kind of interconnectedness, right? Interdependence upon the family to help each other grow and be strong. So to have that family, marriage is the most important event that can occur in a person's life. Divorce is considered the greatest tragedy that can occur. Families favor male offsprings over females, and there's actually a really good documentary because I believe it was India where they basically had ultrasound scans, when women are pregnant to kind of see what the sex of the child is, right? But what happens was when people found out that they were having girls, they would either have abortions or basically kill their child when their child was born, so that they can increase having boys or males or men, because boys are just considered more valuable than women or girls are. Women grow up feeling devalued and have emotional and psychological problems. And that you can see that happening, like girls being told they're not worth anything, right? Now let's talk about Asian American identity development. Do not believe in the myth of the model minority. Again, I want to stress that with you as a counselor, as a helping person. When you see an Asian person, don't just automatically assume that they're successful, smart in math, and stuff like that. Realize that there is a tremendous diversity among Asians in nationality, language, immigration status, educational and occupational levels, and income. And we also need to talk about and be aware of poverty, mental illness, gang affiliation, school failure, domestic violence, incest, addiction, and racism. So those things do appear in Asian cultures as well. There's also the Asian stereotypes of being a China doll, a Tokyo Rose, mysterious, a Charlie Chan, a dragon lady, seen as exotic, insolent, or basically rude or lacking respect, right? Because again, their cultural values are different. Diminutive, which means very small and petite and stuff like that. And of course, the idea that Asian women are mail order brides. So you'll hear about these, and you might not know all of these because some of them are kind of dated terms like Charlie Chan, but basically kind of like, the guy with the small eyes, the long skinny mustache, and stuff like that, what you see in old Hollywood movies about Asian people with buck teeth and stuff like that. A great example of a really horrible Asian caricature or stereotype is in the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's. Okay, just watch it. You'll see a white person playing an Asian person, and with a really bad stereotype of what Asian people look like. And again, recommended articles like I've been trying to do with all of our chapters. Asian and Gambling Addiction is a really interesting article because a lot of Asians tend to be more behaviorally addicted than they are with, let's say, chemicals and drugs and stuff like that. So there's a really great article because you can see a lot of Asian people going to casinos. And part of that is the idea of luck and fortune and stuff like that that comes in Asian culture. So it's a really great article because it says that when casinos pop up in an Asian population or Asian community, divorce goes up, robbery and crime goes up, abuse of children or neglect of children goes up. It's a really amazing article written by the Los Angeles Times or the LA Times. Go Back to China is a New York Times article where basically an Asian family was walking down the street and a woman walking the other way couldn't get around them. So she literally screams, "Go back to China." And the couple's child was like, "Why is that lady telling us to go back to China? We're not from China." And it talks about, being seen as a foreigner in America. Asians in the Library with Alexandra Wallace is this woman who basically put on a YouTube video complaining about Asian people. It's offensively hilarious. It's so rude and offensive that you can't help but kind of laugh. So that's the original video right there. And I want you to see how other cultures might see Asian people in America. The Fung brothers are brothers who basically talk about Asian culture in America. They're really popular on YouTube, and this article is or this YouTube video is about Asian Heritage Month. There's also a thing called "What Kind of Asian Are You?" Again, just look at that. And then there's also a diversity conversation working in Hollywood when you're not white. And that is like a roundtable conversation about being a minority in America in Hollywood. Because again, Asian people are not very often very represented in pop culture.